Hello. Hello.
You're good to go, Terry. You're live. Right, Terry, you're good to go. I think there's a small. All right, Alex. Sorry about that. There's small, I think, network issue on Terry's side. I'm not camera friendly, so I won't activate my camera. But until we wait for Terry to come back, she will. Alex, can you introduce yourself to the public?
Sure. So my name is Alex Avery, and I guess per the title of this meeting, I'm the author of The Wealthy Renter, which is a book that I published in 2016. And in a nutshell, it makes the case for renting as opposed to home ownership for your principal residence. We can get a little bit more into that. At the time that I published the book, I was a equity analyst at CIBC covering Canadian REITs. Did that for about 13 years. Prior to that, I worked as an appraiser. I'm a licensed appraiser. And since 2016, I guess in 2017, I left the bank, started a hedge fund, have acted as an activist investor, and joined the board of a publicly traded REIT, and act as a consultant for a number of different groups in the real estate industry.
Wow, well, what a great background. Again, I repeat, I'm not camera friendly, so I cannot open the mics. We're just waiting for Terry to come back. But Alex, what's the state of the union? You have a great experience, as I can see, as an analyst and in other fields. What is the state of the union actually about the current crisis?
That is a big question. I think there are so many different elements to it. I mean, certainly the human suffering and the toll that this is having on people, not just physically and health-wise, but I think one of the underreported elements of it is really the mental health aspect, which, I mean, we're all sheltering in place, and everyone's got a different situation in terms of how conducive their shelter is to sheltering in place. But what I think we do have in common is that everyone's routine and way of life has been dramatically interrupted, and as it pertains to the investment landscape, I think the results and the implications of the experience that we're going through are very difficult to really nail down. But what you can say is that things are changing, and probably at a faster pace than we would recognize today.
All right, Terry, you're back?
Yes. Okay.
All right. So basically, Alex introduced himself and asked a question about the state of the union about this pandemic. So he was just answering the question. So I'll leave it to you, Terry.
Okay, so I guess the first thing is I'm pretty excited to have this conversation. I read your book, I guess it must be like 2.5 years ago now, and it really created a very nice distinction for me around, I guess, how we use our capital. And, with when I first read Rich Dad Poor Dad many years ago, the main distinction there for me was between passive income and active income. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit, like, let's say in a nutshell, your main thesis from the book around home ownership.
Yeah, okay. Well, I also am very excited to have this conversation. I read The Mindful Landlord and found it fascinating, and also expanded my mind in terms of the way that I think about certainly the business of managing residences. So thank you for having me on. As to the idea behind the book, and I guess to capture it in a nutshell, most concisely, I would say that principal residences are a very poor investment, and that is something that I think runs very contrary to the reputation that most people associate with the principal residence. There are a whole bunch of reasons for that. The mental math that people do, the stories that you hear, your aunt or your uncle or your grandfather bought a house for $25,000 in 1980 and now it's worth $400,000, which sounds really good, but when you actually run the math, the compound annual return on that kind of an investment is really very poor. So the actual math on how people's investments in principal residences have performed and what their perceptions are dramatically different. But it goes much deeper than that. When it comes to a principal residence, I think most of the people listening and watching today are, income and investment oriented, real estate interested people, and I think when you transition to considering owners of principal residences, they're not purely investment focused, and that allows for things like investment creep. You find yourself in the kitchen of the third or fourth house that you've looked at, and the first one was a fixer-upper and it was well below your budget, and the second one was right at your budget, but it had one less bedroom that you wanted, or the kitchen was a little bit old or whatever, and then you're standing in the kitchen of this fabulous house that's 25% more than your maximum budget was, and then you look at your partner and say something like, I think we should go for it. It's an investment, and there's a lot wrong with that statement, because in fact what your principal residence is a mixture of investment, but also a huge component of consumption. And the risk with principal residence is something that I refer to in the book as investment creep, and that is just over consuming in terms of your residence. And you spend 25% more on buying the house, and then that means 25% more on property taxes and utilities and interest and all of the costs associated with an investment. And that differs dramatically from the way that I think landlords think about investments, return on invested capital and cost of maintenance, things like that. And then, when you think about the principal residence from a broader investment perspective, it's kind of crazy to think that one of the most popular investments in amongst Canadians would be an investment where you have to lever up your entire net worth 5 or 10 times, put it into a single asset that is pretty much illiquid with a 5 to 10% transaction cost. And you would consider that to be a prudent investment. I mean, in the investment world, they preach consistently diversification, and that's the polar opposite of it. It's a highly levered single investment. So, I'm definitely a fan of real estate, and I happen to own my own home. It's a long story behind that.
I was going to ask you.
Yeah. It's a complicated answer, but there are a lot more reasons than investment to own your own home. And the purpose of the book was really to try and counter the prevailing wisdom that is out there. And that comes from your parents, it comes from your neighbors, it comes from real estate analysts or real estate agents. It comes from lenders. I mean, everyone has got a pretty strong incentive to get people into home ownership, and it works for everyone, but it doesn't necessarily work for you. And the way that it is encouraged and promoted can lead to all sorts of unintended risks that people take on and perhaps are not aware of.
Okay. Okay, so I hear kind of two answers, and I'm gonna push you maybe a little bit to a third one. So, first of all, I hear one aspect is risk, which is, as you say, that's a really good point. That you're talking about plunking the main seed egg, the main amount of capital that you have in one position, in one market, in one thing. As you say, that's like the opposite of diversification. Then there's the fact that talking about I think Kiyosaki mentions this, that there are assets and there are liabilities, right? And an asset might be something that takes value over time, but if you're required to continue investing your own money in property taxes and renovations and all these different things to maintain that, when you look at the end of the day, what the market value is really going up versus the amount of money that you need to keep pouring in for it to appreciate that way. That's another point. And I think the last point, and I wonder if you could just say something about this, because I think like all of our listeners, like we kind of have the investor's mindset, but yet at the same time, I know I own my own home. And when I bought, I was thinking, well, maybe I'm wasting money on rent, right? Like we all know that it makes sense. Everybody who's listening, I think, is interested in, investing perhaps in addition to owning a home. But why might it not be a good idea to put, let's say, a bunch of your seed capital in there? And you know what? I'm going to let you answer this. I'm going to just go and get something to plug my phone in. So I'm going to disappear, but I'm going to let you answer the question. Okay?
Sure.
1 second.
Sure. So I guess in a nutshell, what all of those questions really boil down to is that the principal residence, investing in your own principal residence leads to all sorts of contributing factors that allow you to behave without discipline. And it starts with, as you mentioned, you're saving on rent. The thing that people don't appreciate is how much rent they might be saving on, to the extent that you pay more for your house each month that you are living in that house. You're effectively paying yourself an amount of rent, and it's not an explicit amount. It's very difficult. I mean, people can calculate it, but no one ever does.
Mm-hmm.
If you ran the math and you figured out what the market rent would be on the house that you own, you would be consuming that amount of um, space use over that monthly period. And I think that when the real test for that would be to have people who happen to own their own home calculate what the rent is, and then have them go out and look at comparable spaces that they might want to rent for that amount. And I think the great thing about being a renter is that it has this very clean, crisp discipline to it, that when you rent an apartment or a house, you know explicitly what you're getting. And that is the use of that space for a finite period of time, and there is no residual value that is left over. And that's where people get really confused. And it's natural with the principal residence, is that you think that it's an investment, and so you're willing to spend more money, and you don't realize how much rent you're actually paying to yourself, which is fine, except that that's rent that if you weren't living in that house, you could be, generating as income. And if you think about that from a personal finance perspective and a broader perspective, if you sold all of, for the people watching, if they sold all of the rental properties that they own, and they took all of that money and they bought the most expensive house that they could afford, they would have an enormous house, but no cash flow and no money. And, for people that are wealthy, you can indulge, but the problem with, I think the housing industry, whether it's real estate agents or, banks or anything else, is that they're providing cookie cutter advice to a broad variety of people. And in particular, I think the audience for my book, one of the audiences was really first-time home buyers. And you have to remember, this was 2016 when I published the book. House prices were on fire. There was a lot of fear of missing out. Everyone wanted to get in, and they were encouraging people who were 22 years old, who hadn't found a partner or figured out what their career was, or made a commitment to a specific market, and they were encouraging them to buy homes that were 5, 10, 15 times their annual income. And when you think about the transaction costs and the risk that they were taking, it was just completely inappropriate. But try and have that argument with your uncle at Thanksgiving dinner, and he's just going to say, like, renting is throwing away your money. Then I think that the financial literacy was really a big part of the reason that I wrote the book, trying to educate people on the risks and the rewards that renting offer relative to home ownership.
Yeah, so I hear then again, like kind of two points there. So one of them is really in terms of the kind of advisors that we surround ourselves with as we go through the process of potentially shopping for something. And like maybe some of us will go through the process of thinking, okay, do I buy myself a duplex or a triplex or a single family home, or should I be just looking at investment properties? And for sure, or like people who maybe wouldn't take the jump into investment properties would consider buying a single family home. Then they meet their mortgage broker, they meet the guy at the bank, they meet a real estate agent, and what are those people going to say? they're not neutral operators. They're not neutral advisors. You know,
Absolutely.
and I think I would like make that recommendation generally is, you know, as you're operating in whatever industry it is, understand how people get paid. Because, for example, when you pay a building inspector, he's not getting commission. He shows up, he's going to give you a state of the union of the house. And so if it's good, if it's bad, it makes no difference to him. A real estate agent only gets paid once he makes the sale. So it means that the skin that he has in the game, it's very different skin than someone who you're paying for just kind of an independent opinion, you know?
The real estate agent setup is even worse than that, because the way that the business model works there is that the agent gets paid based, the biggest driver in terms of their profitability is the volume of transactions.
Yeah.
It's not the price. If you sell the house for 5% more, but it takes twice as long, your return on invested time is dramatically less. So whether, you know, I'm not generalizing to say all real estate agents would behave this way, but the incentive system is in place to encourage real estate agents, to encourage all of their buyers to pay the maximum amount that they possibly can so that they can close the deal as fast as possible, and all of the listing agents to encourage the vendor to sell at the lowest price possible, because the more transactions they do, the more money they make. And, you know, I'm not going so far as to saying that, you know, all real estate agents behave that way, but that is the incentive structure, and it's directly contrary to the interests of a homeowner or a home buyer. And you know, it's not a good situation, and yet that's the biggest investment that most people will make in their entire life. They're going to use a ton of leverage, and their principal advisor is someone who is highly incented to spend as little as possible time with them and get them transacted, regardless of whether it's right for that person. And even further, to the extent that it's not right for them, they stand to get a second commission if that person needs to then change their house.
Yeah. So, I mean, like,
Pretty
I
bad.
think, no, like, I mean, I knew this, but the way you describe it makes it like very starkly clear that it's a bit of a perverted set of rewards, a perverted reward structure.
There was actually a chapter in my book on real estate agents, and I had to take it out.
The publisher didn't like that.
I was just I was a little worried that it would make me very unpopular.
Okay. Can you tell me, was there anything else that got left out of the book through the editing process? Anything else that maybe, if you had a couple of minutes to expand on, you'd like to mention?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, we touched on it earlier. I own my own home. You own a home. It's a very personal choice. And I think, you know, when I go back to the origins of this book, it really came out of an experience that I had now 15 years ago. And it was over a fairly extended period of time. But my wife and I at the time were young professionals. We both had very demanding jobs. We worked long, long hours, and we lived right downtown in Toronto. And we would routinely end up, you know, sitting on a patio at 8 o'clock at night having dinner, and we would talk to the people at the next table. And at some point, someone would say, "Oh, what do you do?" And I would say, "I work at the bank," which usually killed the conversation. But if it didn't, they would then say, "What do you do at the bank?" And I would say, "I'm a real estate analyst." And then the next question always is, "Should I buy a house?" And then I would explain that that's not what I did. But then I would get into all of these conversations, and over, you know, hundreds and hundreds of these conversations, I started to recognize a whole bunch of misconceptions that people had about their homes. You know, just off the top of my head, one that I find everyone can appreciate is, whenever you hear anything about doing a renovation to your house, the two rooms where you get the most bang for your buck are kitchen and your bathroom. And that's not surprising. Usually it's your real estate agent that tells you that, or perhaps it's the contractor. But think about how much money you spend in a kitchen or how much you spend in a bathroom, and compare that to how much money you can possibly spend in your living room. The reason you want to spend money in the kitchen and the bathroom is because the service providers get paid the most from that. And the other thing that people don't talk about when they talk about the bang for your buck is that renovating your kitchen and renovating your bathroom on a principal residence basis, at least, is very much like going out and buying a sports car. It drops 20% the day that you drive it off the lot. And it certainly makes your house worth more. But if you spend $100,000 on the kitchen, the house is probably worth $80,000 more. So it has a negative return on investment, but it's the best return on investment. Kind of a bizarre thing. But back to your question, went through the whole experience of seeing all of these misconceptions, and I started writing them down and just thinking them through and saying, how is it that people are so misguided in their understanding of housing? So I started writing the book, and the book was originally a very investment oriented and singularly, mathematically oriented type of a book, to prove that single family residences are a terrible investment. And I think I managed to accomplish that.
Yes, you did.
But then in 2010, my wife and I started a family. We had twins. And within 6 or 7 months, I was eagerly, comparing school scores, school rankings, and, parks and neighborhood safety, and actively trying to buy a home, despite the fact that I was largely through writing a book about how you should never buy your own home. So then the second half of the book that I wrote in the ensuing years after 2010 was really more about, it's a terrible investment, but, reality is that most people end up buying their own home, certainly in the rest of Canada, a little bit less so in Montreal. But if you're going to do it, here's how you can do it without blowing yourself up. And so I did write that second half of the book, but then the publisher thought, that's really interesting and would be helpful, but we're really more interested in the rental side. And I thought at the time that maybe I'd write a second book called The Wealthy Owner, how to manage home ownership in a prudent and rational way so that you don't blow yourself up.
And what exactly, if I could ask you to give like maybe one or two, or 3 points of like what are the big don'ts when, let's say, you're going to go out, you both of us own a home, I own a home, what should I not do to lose money on this, even more than I'm already losing, let's say?
Yeah, so I think the, really two things I would say. Do not buy a home if you cannot commit to owning that home for, ideally 10 or more years, but at a very minimum 5 or more years. So that pretty much rules out all people in their early 20s. It's a very difficult thing to make that kind of commitment at that phase of your life. And then the second thing is really, I think people generally overestimate their capacity to manage and service debt, and are willing, with the great encouragement of their lenders and the real estate agents, and also your parents and the government of Canada, which encourages people to lever up to buy their homes. I think people over-lever all the time, and they over-consume on housing. And you hear it, and people just don't make the connection to what it is. But this whole idea of being house poor, when you hear all of these housing crisis arguments and how millennials can't afford homes and it's so difficult to get into the market, it's not actually very difficult to get into the market. It's difficult to get into the market for the type of housing that those people aspire to own. If you're more rational and prudent about what you can afford, you'll find yourself living in a much less attractive, much smaller residence, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. Trying to keep up with the Joneses and try and get that extra bedroom for when your in-laws come and stay with you, or the brand new kitchen or the brand new bathroom, those are all examples of consumption that really has nothing to do with your core shelter need. And I think the housing industry just in a very damaging way encourages people to overconsume housing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, I think that's like actually what it is that there is this sort of conflation that takes place in our minds between what is it, what is consumption and what is investment. And I think the principal residence is really set up as this thing that we're taught to think about as an investment, but in fact, it's a consumer item in a way. Yes, it's a consumer item that will gain value over time, but in order to maintain it, you have to put all kinds of money in it, and then what's the opportunity cost of that?
Yep. No, and it's promoted so heavily, and you said it will go up in time. That's not a certain. and I think, you have very strong odds in a market like Montreal or Toronto that your house price would go up over time. But, go and talk to someone living in a secondary market in Saskatchewan.
Yeah.
You can very easily see their house drop by 50 or 75% over a given 5 or 10-year period. There are all sorts of markets, and that's the problem with this very generalized advice. But the second problem is that, you really have to your point, you really have to be careful about who you're taking advice from.
Yeah.
And it's a terrible setup that, most people, not all people, but most people grow up with parents who give them advice and other people that they trust for advice. And those people may not be sophisticated investors, and they may sit there and say, I put some money into the market when I was 25 and I put it into a gold stock and it went to zero and, whatever else. But the one thing that I've accomplished is I bought my house for $25,000 30 years ago, and now it's worth $400,000. It's got to be a great investment, not recognizing that even though they paid $25,000 notionally when they bought it, they actually have invested hundreds of thousands of dollars in the new kitchen and the new bathroom, and then all of the maintenance costs across the time period, plus the interest on the purchase price, and the return on their investment has been absolutely dismal.
Yeah.
And yet, that's the only experience they have, and they don't even have the investment wherewithal to recognize that it has not been a good investment. It just so happens that they took half of their paycheck every month and they put it towards their house over 40 years. It could have actually been a negative return, but they would have no way of telling that.
Yeah. No, and I think if that speaks to anything, it's really, also who you take advice from. And I think things like housing, just like things like, right now, economics or let's say virology, epidemiology, right? Like are things that everybody has an opinion on. And when you listen and you take those opinions, like my advice is I always say, like, if I only take the advice from people who are where I would want to be. So somebody who is entitled to give me their opinion, if it's like my brother-in-law who, like you said, owns a single family home and has been paying that for 10 years and has no investment experience, when he tells me it's a bad idea to buy an investment property, I'd be like, okay, it's nice that you think that, but like ultimately, unless you're in a position that is enviable to me or that you've accomplished something or have some knowledge that I don't have, just having another opinion, it's anecdotal.
Yeah. And that whole idea of having, the expertise and the knowledge, everyone has an opinion about real estate, and almost no one has any basis for having that opinion. Understanding, if you just ask people, what is it that makes properties go up and down? You'll get a absolutely insane number of different opinions. And that was, my experience sitting on these patios talking to people about how house prices always go up. And it's like, well, why? Why would you say that? And why do you think that? Oh, because they have gone up? Well, lots of things have gone up, and then sometimes they come back down. You might want to understand a little bit more before you take, 5 times your net worth and lever up 15 times to buy that investment.
So let me move on then. If we're down on the principal residence, are you then a real estate guy? Do you believe that investing in real is like, what's a good way to invest your money then? If your principal residence is not a good place for your capital, what is a good place for your capital, in your opinion?
Yeah, this is a moment where, I think understanding yourself is a lot more important than understanding the market. Understanding the market is extremely difficult. I spent 13 years analyzing real estate companies, looking at their strategies, looking at their properties, looking at the management, looking at the execution, capital structures. There's a absolute world of stuff that you can spend an entire lifetime trying to understand. But the starting point for providing advice on investments, I think, always has to start with yourself. And that is, what are your personal financial objectives? Are you trying to make money? Can you afford to take the risks? What kind of risks are you comfortable with? And so, I think that, to the point of, or the ambition of my book, really providing more financial literacy, I think the first thing that people should do is decide whether or not they want to make an investment in having a better understanding of the investment landscape and investment principles. And to the extent that they are, there's a whole wide variety of things that you can invest in. But on the on the alternative, if you're not super willing to spend a lot of time and get educated on investments and the landscape, then I think there are some really easy things that you can do. There are index funds. There's something that I refer to in my book, which has always been a favorite of mine, which is the Dividend Aristocrats Index, which is a broad index of publicly traded stocks in companies that have a history of raising their dividend every year for a period of time. Generally speaking, they're very defensive companies that have been around for a very long time, and it provides good discipline with the payment of dividends. So that one's, one that I generally like. You also asked whether I'm a real estate guy. I'm a huge real estate guy. I think real estate is a fabulous investment, particularly when you have the discipline of it not being your principal residence, where you can look at it and say, how much should I spend on the kitchen? If I spend this much, how much more rent can I get? What kind of return on investment is that? That kind of thing is really what's missing from the principal residence. I think early on in the education process, one of the things you learn is diversification and risk concentration. And so, I'm a big fan of owning real estate. It's a little bit challenging, particularly for smaller investors, to jump into the world of buying rental properties without making a fairly significant concentrated investment. But that being said, within the world of real estate, residential tends to be one of the more conservative property types. There's a very slow pace of new supply and a generally consistent pace of new demand. So the fundamentals tend to be fairly stable. You can often end up putting a lot of leverage on, but I think residential, multi-residential are pretty good places to start if you want to get into the direct real estate world. And so, I think REITs are another way to go about it. If you look at the most conservative REITs, they tend to have low leverage, low payout ratio, high credit quality tenants, and those tend to be fairly stable investments over long periods of time. And if you really wanted to get into the crazy, talk of the day, I think the monetary policy that you're seeing today is highly irresponsible. They're printing money like crazy, debasing the currency, which can lead to inflation. And from that perspective, right now is a really interesting time to own real estate, because it has, amongst of all of the different investment types, whether it's equities or commodities or fixed income or gold or cryptocurrency, I think real estate has some of the most attractive real return aspects to it. But that's a long conversation.
Well, okay, so let's, I think, we had a kind of a general conversation about, the book, the general concepts of principal residence and consumption and that kind of stuff. But if now we move into the specific situation of what's going on now, like you said, it is an interesting time, and it's a time where we have a lot of questions. So what do you see happening? How do you see this evolving? And what do you think like the challenges are, let's say, for the different markets across Canada?
Yeah. So I will take the Canada thing first. And then I'll look at the broader. So when it comes to property in Canada, having been an analyst that covered North American real estate equities, but in large part it was focused on Canada. I looked around the world. I followed Asian REITs and European REITs and South American REITs and looked all around the world. And Canada actually has a really special market structure when you look at different markets, particularly in contrast to the U.S. The U.S. is a much less attractive market in my mind as a market to invest in from a real estate perspective. And the defining characteristic that I look to first when I look at all investments in real estate is the land constraints. And land constraints are critically important because they dictate supply. And there are permanent land constraints. You're sitting, in Montreal, which is primarily comprised of 2 islands. That's fabulous. Toronto has a giant green belt around it. Vancouver is sandwiched between the mountains. and the ocean. And those three markets in Canada are about 70% of the investable universe when it comes to institutional real estate investment. And when you look at, for instance, what happened in the US housing market in the 2002 to 2010 period, you had this unbelievably euphoric market initially that was driven a lot by government policies to encourage more home ownership and more consumption. And the markets that took the greatest surges and the greatest falls were the unconstrained markets like Las Vegas, Phoenix, Atlanta, Charlotte, those types of markets. I mean, Vegas went up by about 400% and then dropped about 80%. It ended where it started, and in reality, there was no reason for house prices to ever have gotten that high. But there was a period of time where population growth was 7% per year, and it was primarily that high because there were so many jobs. Most of the jobs were building houses for all the people moving there, and it was just this crazy feedback loop. And then when it all stopped, they realized there was no shortage of land, and you could build as many houses as you wanted if you were willing to wait for them. And in contrast, if you look at like a market like San Francisco or New York or even Miami, you know, very expensive markets, but seriously land constrained, the declines that you saw even off of elevated levels were much less. So I think the Canadian market tends to be a very stable market, a very defensive market, and it has very attractive long-term characteristics. And, you know, as I've shared with you, I'm a big fan of the Montreal market in particular, but Montreal, Toronto, and Vancouver, I think, are great long-term markets to own assets in. The trade-off is that the yields available are not super juicy at this point. And then I don't know if you wanted to sort of dig into a broader, like, what's happening in the economy or how that's affecting real estate.
No, well, I think, you know, a lot of, me included, and a lot of our members are trying to make sense of, you know, the next 6 months or a year worth of decision making. Okay. So I think all in all, like, we have confidence, let's say in our, you know, let's say in the Montreal market or in the Quebec market or in specific markets that we were eyeing investments in before COVID happened. And now we're in the situation where you say, you know, the government's printing money and we've got unemployment going up and different kinds of things like that. How concerned should we be, and what should we keep our eye on, let's say, in our decision making process in the next 6 months?
Yeah, I mean the policy is probably the starting point. And what's interesting is if you contrast the 2008-2009 crisis with what's happening today. Back then, the crisis was really a liquidity crisis in the financial and banking system. And if you go back and look at the timing of all of the policy announcements, the TARP and the TALF and the QE1 and QE2 and QE3 and all of those different things, policy response was extremely slow to come about. I mean, it was months between significant investment or announcements, and then you know, they didn't work, and then they had to go back and they had to try again, and then it was just not clear what was happening. But what was happening was that, you know, if you take Canada, for instance, if the head of the Bank of Canada and the Minister of Finance get together on a Sunday and decide that there's a new policy, they have a conference call Sunday night with 6 bank CEOs, and by Monday afternoon, that policy is in place and it is being acted upon by 90-something% of the banking industry in Canada. Very, very slow to bring policy, but once the policy was announced, it was very effective immediately. And what you've seen this time, I remember, I mean, it seems like a lifetime ago, but 45 days ago or 60 days ago, sitting there thinking, you know, the policy response has to be very specific and it has to come, you know, very quickly. And the way that I thought about it was really 2 policies. The first one was to provide liquidity to the bottom decile or quartile of the socioeconomic base of all of the people, you know, the barista working at Starbucks or the, you know, waiter at the pizzeria. You need to have money in their pockets so that they can continue to pay their cable bills and their phone bills and their rent and all of those things. So this idea of helicopter money and, you know, mailing checks out to people, that was one policy that I thought was very important to get done. And the second one was these forgivable loans to employers. And the most important characteristic of those loans was that you make them forgivable contingent on the employer not laying off that person. Because once you separate an employee from their employer, the employee begins making decisions immediately, and it becomes very damaging to the economy. You get laid off, and then you make a decision about your cell phone, and then maybe you know, do a midnight move home to live in your parents' basement, and you cancel your, you know, all of your subscriptions, and that has a feedback loop on the economy that can be very damaging. And so what was really encouraging during March of this year was that those policies came out very quickly. And they were announced, and I mean, to think that helicopter money was a policy that, you know, at the beginning of March, on March 1st, 2 months ago today, um, if you asked the Democrats, they would have said, you know, we're not taking it seriously. There's a couple of crazy people in the far left of our party who are talking about it, but I swear to God, we're not seriously considering it. And then the Republicans would have never, you know, entertained even having a discussion about it. To a couple of weeks later, the debate was: is it $1,200 a month or is it $2,000? I mean, the speed of the policy announcements and the policy implementation was truly remarkable, and it was exactly what was needed. But where it really has failed so far is that the implementation. And you know, that call that you have on Sunday night with the bank CEOs to get the policy implemented were reflective of how organized the banking system is. And the problem that we're facing now is how disorganized the broader economy is. I mean, to tell people that you know, there's a check coming to them from the government and they should not worry is great, except that, you know, they may not have filed taxes the year before. They may not even have a bank account. I mean, you'd be surprised at how many people don't have bank accounts, which is mind blowing. And then when it comes to the employer side, I mean, I consult with a bunch of different organizations, but I remember having a call on a Sunday night, the same weekend that they were initially proposing the CARES Act in the US, with a guy who runs a business in the US, and he was telling me that he was laying off, you know, a quarter of his staff. And I said, you know, and this is a, you know, highly sophisticated, knowledgeable person. I said, like, whoa, you know that there are loans that are going to be forgivable that are coming from the government. And he said, you know, well, I kind of heard something about that, but I can't wait for that. So I have to go ahead and, you know, act in the best interest of my business, which is kind of one of those prisoner's dilemma, where if everyone behaves rationally and everyone adheres to these policies and the intent of the policy, then there will be very little separation of employers from their employees. But I think that ship has already sailed. And, you know, this notion that this recession was triggered by a virus, and once we get the, you know, the treatment or the vaccine or whatever, then we can go back to business as usual, is just completely off base. I think we're in for a fairly serious recession here, and from that perspective, I think the advice that I would give to people would be, you know, be very careful about the amount of leverage that you take on. And be very, very attentive to your operations. I mean, it is going to be a very challenging economic situation for the next, certainly 6 months, but probably much longer than that. And so, you know, being very proactive on your relationships with your tenants, working with them, and at, you know, at risk of, you know, suggesting people accept less than ideal outcomes. I mean, I think maintaining occupancy is a huge, huge advantage in this environment.
And what about, I mean, you kind of touched on it briefly before, like, let's say investment property is an asset class right now. I mean, we saw like the stock market take a total hit. I'm not a stocks person, so I don't really have any real opinion on how or when things are going to start rebounding. But like, let's say as an asset class, acquiring more real estate or being real estate heavy, we're all going to have a bit of a difficult time now. But how does the real estate investor fare in comparison with everybody else? How do you see that evolving?
Yeah, I mean, everybody else is a pretty broad basket. I think within the equities world, you've got things like pipelines and utilities. I think those things are going to do quite well. I'm reasonably optimistic about Canadian banks. They're well capitalized, and it is a regulated oligopoly. So, I don't think that's going to be too terrible. I think the retail industry is in for a world of pain, and I think that will impact retail landlords as well. I think there's going to be a lot of bankruptcy there. I mean, retail was already a property type that was facing a lot of headwinds. I think what this crisis will do will be to bring forward the gradual pain that those landlords would feel for the next 5 or 10 years and make it into one sort of tearing the band-aid off experience, which will be extremely painful, but also should result in a cleansed retailer landscape and a cleansed retail landlord landscape. I think you'll see landlords with a lot less leverage and fewer but more profitable retailers, which should be positive. And I think you'll see the demolition of a lot of retail space, which is obsolete at this point. So I think there are some silver linings there. But as a general statement, I think that relative to all of the other asset classes out there, fixed income, equities, gold, commodities, I think real estate is in a good spot. And within real estate, I think land constraints are probably the thing that you really want to focus on the most, because your fundamentals might be strong, but if you're in a market where there are an unlimited ability to add new supply, like Calgary and Edmonton, for instance, I think those markets are going to be very challenged for a very long time.
Okay. Okay, that kind of comes to the end of the questions that I had for you today. I don't know if you had any kind of like comments or statements or anything you felt like I left out that you wanted to touch on.
Just looking at my notes. There's nothing. I think we covered most of what I was thinking about. I think just to go back to the origin of the wealthy renter, I just very much encourage all Canadians and all people to really pursue some financial literacy. The financial services industry has a terrible reputation for a lack of alignment of interests with their clients, just like real estate agents. And having worked at a bank for 13 years, I can confirm that it's not undeserving. So I think the more financial literacy that you can gain yourself, that you can instill in your children, I think the fact that it's not part of the core curriculum of primary schools in Canada is just a wasted opportunity. I think there's a huge amount of benefit that can be passed along by teaching financial literacy.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think that's, I mean, I often like to play the game, if I was prime minister, what would I do? And like definitely doing something with the education, just math class, right? Like, I don't know. I think there's a lot of content there that maybe if it was like shifted a little bit would do people a much better service than what they're being prepared for right now. Kind of.
I agree.
Now I don't know. Because I'm on my cell phone, I don't have any audience questions that are appearing for me. Do you have that on your screen?
I do. Here, hold on.
There we go. So I have Stella saying it would be nice to hear Alex's opinion on real estate in the USA and other countries, if he could comment on it.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, the US is a really interesting market, and it's, they say real estate is a local business, and I absolutely and completely agree with that. So I think the US is a fairly broad market to define as a market. I think that there are a lot of differences between property types. I think retail is a very challenged market, particularly in unconstrained markets. But as a broad market to just paint some contrasts, I think there are some really significant differences between the Canadian market and the US market that are particularly relevant to what's happening in the market today. And the first one is the prevalence of non-recourse debt. So in the US, when you borrow most mortgages and a lot of other debt, well, most mortgages are non-recourse, which means that in the event that you default on a payment, the lender is limited to seizing the asset. They can't come after the owner of the property for anything beyond the asset. And that is something that structurally makes the US market more volatile, and also makes borrowers much more likely to default. If you don't have to pay back the debt and the property value drops below the value of the debt, it's just very hands-off and very easy to default. So you end up seeing a lot more defaults in the US, and that also leads to more irrational behavior in terms of the use of too much leverage. And then the second thing that is much more common in the US is the merchant building industry. So there's a lot more, just a lot more speculative building that goes on in the US. And as I mentioned, this whole like land constraint, supply constraint thing is a huge factor in my thinking about real estate. The fact that they have this merchant building industry is really in part driven by something called a 1031 exchange, also known as a like-kind exchange, which is to say that if a property owner owns a property, say you own it for 25 or 30 years, if you were to go and sell it, you don't have to pay capital gains on the sale, provided you reinvest the proceeds of that sale into another property within a 6-month period. And what that does is that it creates a constant buyer pool for real estate, and it creates this perverse incentive for people to transact in the market, which also increases the liquidity, which can be a good thing, but it also increases the liquidity, which supports this merchant building industry. So you end up getting more supply, higher leverage, and more likelihood of default. So I think you need to be more careful in the US would be the way that I would describe it. More selective about the types of properties that you buy, more selective about the markets that you buy in, and make sure that you have a good handle on both the supply and the demand pictures for whatever type of property it is that you're investing in.
But so that makes me think of something else. So, I mean, given the fact that, I think you spoke a little bit to the fact that Canada is a pretty safe market. We have 5 major banks. We have already, lending criteria that are built in a certain way to keep the market stable. But I mean, if you look at the current situation with what's going on in the US, I mean, do you think that they're in for a second housing catastrophe there with what's going on?
Not so much on the housing front, and I follow the housing market very closely in the US. The problems that led to the first housing crisis were, you can trace them back to about 2002, and there were a whole bunch of policies. One of them was, my favorite one was called the American Dream Down Payment Fund, and the explicit purpose of this was to help Americans overcome the #1 impediment to home ownership, which was having money for a down payment, which completely eliminates all discipline related to buying a house. So they ended up really, really encouraging home ownership through a variety of policies. There was a surge. People were buying 2 and 3 homes. You had this massive oversupply. And then you had this catastrophic crash, which bankrupted all sorts of people. And what we saw in the wake of that actually was quite interesting. You had, maybe 2.5 million homes of excess supply created in the 5 years up to the crisis from overbuilding. And then in the subsequent years, I mean, the housing completions, housing starts in the years after the crisis dropped to below average or below demographic demand by about 1 million a year. And that persisted for about 4 or 5 years. And then it gradually caught up. But even as of 2019, the U.S. was not building enough residences to satisfy the demographic demand and the obsolescence. I mean, you can sort of pick your number.
We just lost Alex, Terrie.
Yeah, I see that. It was right in the middle of an interesting point.
Yeah, it was right in the middle of something. But if you do come back, I think it's just going to be the word of It's gonna be the last question, I think, because we want to finish that one. So we'll wait a few seconds. I'll post you a question maybe in ahead of time here from François. I'm just gonna close the door. So
That's a good question. Let's hope he comes back. Anyways, either way, I guess.
yeah, go ahead. No, I'm still
No, I
there.
was going to say either way. I think he should probably be able to answer that in the feed afterwards. Whatever. Oh, good, great, you're back, Alex.
Yeah, I'm not sure what happened there.
Okay, so look, we're kind of running out of time here, so I think we're gonna just have time for one last question. And it's I don't know if you see it on your screen. It's a good one. It's, what is the question you would like people to ask you that they never ask you?
Would you like to take a nap? I have 4 children under 10. This work from home thing has been quite a challenge. They're all lovely and I love them, but I'm not sure I like them.
I'll second that. I'll give you a big thumbs up on that one.
Yeah, no, that is a really good question. And maybe I'll send you a response when I've got some time to think about it, and you can circulate it to the person who asked.
Okay. All right. Well, look, Alex, I wanted to say, like, thanks for taking the time to have this discussion with me. I know for sure that there's going to be a couple of takeaways from this. I feel like I got a better understanding, maybe the differences between the US and the Canadian market. And, you know, these like macro discussions, I think we have a tendency, let's say in Montreal, to get very preoccupied with our local market and the local conditions here. And I think like a nice zoom out like that is very interesting. And who knows, maybe we're going to get a chance to have you back on again, perhaps in a different set of circumstances, and we can like get into some other stuff like that. So thank you.
Excellent. Well, thanks for having me on. I really enjoyed it, and I hope it was useful.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Bye.